Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This isn't just a poetic observation. It's a psychological warning. Because the unconscious isn't simply a dark basement of forgotten memories, it's an active force, shaping your choices, filtering your perceptions, and attracting into your life the very dynamics you're most vulnerable until you bring them into the light. What if I told you that a single sentence, seemingly harmless, can expose the deepest shadows of someone's psyche, that beneath everyday remarks like, "You're too sensitive," or "I'm just being honest," lies a pattern so deeply embedded in the unconscious mind that it can shape, manipulate, and even destroy your sense of reality? You've probably heard these phrases before, maybe from a partner, maybe from someone you trusted, maybe from someone who, at first, made you feel seen, to later make you question everything about yourself. Phrases like, "You're overreacting," "You used to be different," or "You're acting crazy." At first, they seem like simple disagreements, but repeated often enough, they start to work like psychological acid, corroding your confidence, dissolving your intuition, and replacing your inner clarity with self-doubt. This video is not just about relationships, it's about power. The kind of power that operates in the shadows, quiet, subtle, and devastating. We're going to explore how unconscious psychological patterns, what Jung called the shadow, reveal themselves in intimate relationships. How certain types of people use emotionally manipulative language, not out of malice alone, but because they themselves are ruled by inner dynamics they've never faced. And if you don't recognize it, you'll absorb it. You'll internalize their projections. You'll shrink to fit the version of you they feel most comfortable with. And you won't even realize it's happening until it's too late. Carl Jung, one of the most influential figures in the history of psychology, spent his life trying to map out what hides beneath the surface of human behavior. Unlike Freud, who focused largely on childhood and suppressed desires, Jung went further. He introduced ideas that reshaped how we understand not just the individual mind, but the human experience itself. The person or social mask, the version of us we present to the world, the shadow, the unconscious parts of ourselves we deny, repress, or are ashamed of, and the archetypes, universal psychic patterns that live in all of us, from the hero to the victim, from the trickster to the lover. And here's the key. The shadow isn't just your anger, jealousy, or fear. It also contains your strength, your voice, your emotional intelligence, everything that was once punished, ignored, or misunderstood. When someone tells you, "You're too emotional," they're not simply offering feedback. They're projecting their own discomfort with vulnerability. Their shadow is speaking through them. And if you've been conditioned to doubt your emotions, their words enter you like a virus. You start second-guessing your reactions. You apologize for your boundaries. You mistake cruelty for honesty. And before you know it, your intuition is no longer your guide. Someone else's comfort is. Let's pause here, because this is important. If you've ever been in a relationship where you felt more confused than clear, where your joy faded into guilt, where your standards quietly disappeared to keep someone else from pulling away, then what we're talking about isn't theoretical. It's your life. And if you've ever wondered, how did I get here? Why didn't I see it sooner? Why do I still miss someone who made me feel so small? Then stay with me. You're not broken. You're not foolish. You're not weak. What you experienced was likely not just emotional neglect, but psychological manipulation rooted in the dynamics of the unconscious. And the sooner we name it, the sooner you take your power back. Because here's the truth. Relationships are mirrors, but they're not always clean mirrors. Sometimes they reflect back our deepest wisdom. Other times, they reflect the unhealed wounds of someone else's psyche. And unless you've brought awareness to your own shadow, your own hidden needs, fears, and wounds, you won't see where theirs ends and yours begins. Jung believed that the process of becoming a whole person, what he called individuation, required confronting our inner darkness. Not to shame it, not to run from it, but to integrate it, to say, yes, this is also me. Only then can you stop unconsciously repeating the same relationship patterns over and over. Only then can you love from wholeness, not from wounding. This video is the first step toward that awareness, not by shaming anyone, not by turning you into a skeptic of every person you meet, but by offering you a lens clear, sharp, and deeply compassionate through which to understand yourself and others more clearly. Because once you learn to recognize the language of manipulation not just in others, but in yourself, you begin to move differently. You stop excusing behavior that feels wrong just because it's familiar. You start trusting the signals your body sends, even if your mind tries to rationalize them away. And most importantly, you begin to reclaim the parts of you that someone once tried to silence. This isn't just about romantic relationships. This is about every area of your life, your voice, your peace, your future. And once you learn what to look for, you'll never unsee it again. So, if you've ever lost yourself while loving someone else, if you've ever felt that quiet sense of unease around words that were supposed to be caring but somehow felt off, or if you're ready to finally see through the mask and understand what's really being said, this is the conversation you've been waiting for. Because beneath the surface of those 5 seemingly harmless phrases lies a system of psychological control. And today, we're going to decode each one through the lens of Carl Jung's most powerful insights. Stay with me. Your awareness begins now. No one can love without projecting their shadow onto another. This statement by Carl Jung is not a metaphor. It's a psychological law. And once you begin to understand how projection works, our unconscious wounds shape our attraction, you'll start to see your past relationships in a completely new light. You'll understand that what you called love was often a reflection of your own inner landscape, and that the people we choose aren't always chosen from wholeness, but from wounding. Let's begin with the concept of the shadow. For Jung, the shadow represents the part of the unconscious that contains all the aspects of ourselves we've rejected, disowned, or were never allowed to develop. These can be traits, we've been told, our unacceptable anger, ambition, assertiveness, deep vulnerability, even positive qualities like creativity, power, and emotional sensitivity. The shadow isn't evil. It's simply unknown. And because it's unconscious, it operates beneath our awareness, subtly influencing our behaviors, reactions, and most importantly, our attractions. When you fall in love, you don't just fall for a person. You fall for the parts of yourself you see reflected in them. And often, what you see in them is the unacknowledged shadow inside you. This is where projection comes in. Projection is the psychological mechanism by which we see in others what we have not yet claimed or healed in ourselves. It's not intentional. It happens automatically. You meet someone, and something in them strikes you deeply. Maybe it's their emotional depth, their mysterious sadness, their intense passion, or their detached charisma. You can't explain why, but you're drawn to them. They feel familiar, magnetic, as if they fill some invisible space inside you. That's projection. In romantic relationships, this becomes even more complex. Jung introduced the idea of the animus, the masculine archetype within the unconscious of every woman. Just as men carry an inner anima, women carry an animus, the internalized image of masculinity formed from early experiences, cultural ideals, and repressed desires. This animus shapes how a woman perceives men, what qualities she finds attractive, and how she responds in relationships. If a woman has internalized a distorted or wounded animus, let's say, shaped by a father figure who was emotionally unavailable, or by media that glorifies men who are tortured, aloof, or emotionally erratic, then her unconscious animus seeks out that same dynamic in real life. Not because it's healthy, but because it's familiar. She becomes drawn to men who replicate those traits, believing it's chemistry, fate, or destiny. But really, it's a form of repetition, a reenactment of unfinished emotional business, the unconscious longing to master what once wounded her. And this is exactly how many women find themselves loving men who are emotionally distant, controlling, or chronically unavailable. They're not seeing the man for who he is. They're seeing the projection of their inner animus. He becomes the screen onto which their own unresolved patterns are cast. This also explains why the same type of relationship seems to repeat, even with different partners. It's not a coincidence. It's a pattern driven by unconscious forces, the parts of the self that haven't yet come into the light. And the tragedy is that many women have been conditioned to see this pattern as romantic. Society has taught women to equate emotional labor with love, to interpret inconsistency as mystery, to think that healing a broken man is proof of devotion. The cultural narrative says, if he's closed off, just wait. If he's hurting, love him harder. If he mistreats you, understand him deeper. This storyline isn't love. It's psychological entrapment, and it trains women to distrust their own emotional warning signals. What makes this even more insidious is that our collective storytelling through films, books, and media glorifies this exact dynamic. The tortured genius, the bad boy with a heart of gold, the emotionally unavailable man who just needs the right woman to open up. These archetypes are romanticized versions of unintegrated shadow elements. They sell the illusion that chaos means passion and that suffering means soul connection. In truth, they normalize dysfunction and keep people locked in cycles of emotional self-abandonment. Jung warned us that unless we integrate the shadow, it will show up outside of use in the form of people who activate our deepest wounds. You'll think you're falling in love, when really, you're being pulled toward a lesson. And unless you become conscious of that pull, you'll keep confusing trauma bonding with intimacy. But there's another layer to this. It's not just about who you're drawn to. It's also about who you overlook. Women who are still dancing with their wounded animus often find stable, kind, emotionally available men to be boring. Why? Because these men don't mirror their unresolved chaos. These men don't activate the trauma response disguised as butterflies. And when you're used to emotional highs and lows, peace can feel like a lack of chemistry. This is where the real work begins. It requires looking within and asking, what part of me feels undeserving of consistency? Why does love feel more real when it hurts? What am I projecting onto others that I haven't yet integrated in myself? Jung's solution wasn't to avoid relationships. It was to become conscious of your projections, to recognize that the partner you are most magnetized by might also be the one who reflects your most unhealed parts. And that real love requires seeing clearly, not through the lens of fantasy, but through the clarity of awareness. Once you begin to recognize your projections, you start to reclaim your power. You begin to see that the person who hurt you wasn't inherently powerful. They were merely the carrier of a lesson your unconscious needed you to learn. You start to understand that the love you were chasing was really a mirror of your inner child's longing. And you begin the process of individuation, bringing all those fragmented parts of yourself back into wholeness. Loving from wholeness is radically different than loving from woundedness. It's not about fixing someone, it's about seeing them clearly and being seen in return. It's not about proving your worth through sacrifice. It's about choosing relationships where your worth is never in question. And most importantly, it's about breaking the trance of projection, so you no longer confuse the echoes of your past with the voice of your future. Until you do this, you won't just attract the same type of partner, you'll also repeat the same dynamic, not because you're cursed, but because your psyche is trying to get your attention. Every toxic relationship isn't a punishment, it's a mirror. And when you finally see what it's reflecting, you can stop trying to change them and start transforming yourself. Because at the core of all this is a truth most of us were never taught. You don't have to earn love by suffering. You don't have to be someone's healer to be worthy of their care. You don't have to abandon your boundaries to be accepted. You simply have to see clearly and choose differently. Words are not just communication tools. They are containers of unconscious energy. They reveal what lies beneath the surface of fears, defenses, insecurities, and control mechanisms. Carl Jung believed that when the unconscious seeks expression, it often does so through projection, slips, symbols, and, most powerfully, language, especially in intimate relationships. Certain phrases become more than just words. They become weapons or warnings. And today, we're going to decode 5 of the most common manipulative phrases using Jungian psychology, showing how each one exposes a deeper psychic dynamic. Let's start with the first. You're too sensitive. And, on the surface, this might sound like a harmless opinion, even a casual observation, but its psychological effect is profound. It's a phrase that immediately invalidates your emotional reality. It tells you that your feelings are excessive, unjustified, or inconvenient. In Jungian terms, this phrase reveals what we might call the repression of the feminine principle. Jung described feminine energy not in terms of gender, but in terms of archetypes as deeply intuitive, emotionally attuned, nurturing, and connected to the unconscious. When someone tells you that you're too sensitive, they are often rejecting that archetypal energy, and in many cases, it reflects their own discomfort with their internal animathy, repressed feminine within the psyche. For women, hearing this phrase repeatedly creates a slow erosion of self-trust. Over time, they learn to doubt their intuition, suppress emotional signals, and tolerate behavior that feels wrong simply to avoid being called too much. The shadow aspect here is the collective and personal disowning of emotional intelligence, a suppression of what Jung would call the soul's voice. The healthy response is not to defend your sensitivity, but to reclaim it. Sensitivity is not a flaw. It's data. It's your body and psyche communicating something important. When someone tries to make you feel guilty for feeling deeply, what they're really saying is, your awareness makes me uncomfortable. That's their work, not yours. Now consider this one. I'm just being honest. This phrase often comes right after a comment that hurts you, a jab at your appearance, your intelligence, your dreams. It's used as a shield, a way to disguise cruelty as virtue. But Jung would argue that this isn't honesty. It's persona. The persona is the mask we wear to function in society, the curated self we present to the world. But when someone hides behind honesty to inflict pain, what they're really doing is using the persona to justify their shadow. They weaponize truth not to connect, but to control. This phrase is a prime example of what Jung called moralism, where the outer display of ethics masks an unconscious drive for dominance. This kind of communication isn't about truth. It's about power, and it creates a double bind. If you react, you're too sensitive. If you stay silent, you internalize the message. Over time, this erodes your self-esteem and confuses your sense of right and wrong. You begin to believe that being hurt is a necessary price for receiving truth. M. A healthy psyche knows that real honesty is relationality, considers timing, delivery, and care. When someone uses honesty to elevate themselves while diminishing you, what they're revealing is not their truth, but their inability to be truly intimate. The antidote is discernment. Ask yourself, is this feedback offered with compassion? Does it build or break? Real honesty heals. False honesty harms. Now we move to a more overt form of manipulation. You're being controlling. And this phrase is often thrown at you when you express a boundary, when you say, "Please call if you're going to be late," or "I'm uncomfortable when you flirt with other people." And the response is, "You're trying to control me." It's not just gaslighting, it's psychological inversion. In Jungian terms, this is a classic case of shadow projection. The person making the accusation is often the one attempting to avoid accountability. They label your reasonable needs as oppressive because your boundaries expose their unwillingness to consider others. The deeper truth is that boundaries are not control. They are clarity. They are expressions of self-respect. When someone responds to boundaries with resistance, what they're really saying is, "Your needs interfere with my convenience." End quote. This reveals an immature, unintegrated, shadow someone who resents limits because they equate freedom with a lack of responsibility. But freedom without responsibility is not freedom. It's chaos. And relationships built on one-sided freedom are not partnerships. They're performance pieces where one person writes the script and the other is expected to follow without question. The way out of this trap is to anchor yourself in the understanding that boundaries are not threats. They are invitations to intimacy, to safety, to mutual respect. A person who accuses you of being controlling for expressing a need is revealing their own fear of connection. Do not internalize that fear. Now let's look at one of the most confusing and damaging phrases. "I'm not ready for something serious right now." But he texts you daily, spends weekends with you, introduces you to his friends, talks about your future. Then, when you bring up commitment, he reminds you, "I told you I wasn't ready." This is what we might call existential gaslighting. Jung didn't use that term, but he understood the psychic damage caused when reality is consistently contradicted by behavior. This dynamic creates what he called neurosis, a split in the psyche where your lived experience and your conscious beliefs no longer align. You feel chosen and rejected at the same time, loved and not loved, secure and disposable. This is not ambiguity. It's emotional manipulation, and it exploits your hope. It tells you, if you're patient enough, if you don't push, maybe he'll come around. But that's the trap. The relationship is sustained not by commitment, but by potential. And potential is not love. It's a projection. From a Jungian lens, this person is offering you a fantasy rooted in your own unmet needs. They draw out your animus, the inner masculine who wants to be chosen, wanted, seen. But what you're really experiencing is a loop, a psychological postponement of truth. You become addicted to the version of love that always feels just out of reach. The way to exit this limbo is radical honesty with yourself. Ask, does his behavior align with his words? Does this relationship honor my worth? Am I building something realer, waiting for someone to finally see me? Stop listening to promises. Start observing patterns. And finally, perhaps the most psychologically invasive phrase, "You've changed." Not said in celebration, but in disappointment, not spoken with awe, but with accusation. This phrase targets your evolution. It suggests that your growth is betrayal, that who you were before smaller, quieter, more accommodating was better, and now that you're more self-assured, more boundaried, more awake, you've somehow lost value. This is one of the most dangerous projections of all. because it plays directly into our deepest fears. The fear of abandonment, the fear of being unlovable when fully expressed. Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires us to outgrow our former selves. And yet, people who benefited from your unconsciousness will resist your expansion. When someone says, "You've changed in this way," what they're really saying is, "I missed the version of you I could control." They're grieving their access to the version of you who tolerated what the real you would never allow. This is the shadow's final plea. It doesn't want you to grow, because your growth exposes their stagnation. Your confidence highlights their insecurity. Your clarity threatens their hold. The response here is simple, but not easy. You affirm, "Yes, I've changed, because I'm healing, because I'm becoming, because I'm finally choosing myself." And anyone who cannot celebrate that does not belong in the next chapter of your story. In the end, each of these phrases is not just manipulations. They are revelations. They reveal who someone really is. They show you whether they're living in their shadow or confronting it, whether they seek connection or control, whether they want to love you or own you. When you begin to hear language through the lens of consciousness, you'll stop being confused. You'll stop over-explaining. You'll stop shrinking. And most importantly, you'll stop mistaking emotional chaos for love. Because real love doesn't silence you. It doesn't punish your growth. It doesn't require you to abandon your truth to feel safe. Real love saves you, all of you, especially the parts that someone else once tried to shame. That's the kind of love you're here for. And that begins not with finding the right person, but with recognizing the wrong patterns. Emotions are the language of the soul. To deny them is to lose your inner map. And yet, for many who have been entangled in manipulative or emotionally unbalanced relationships, this denial doesn't begin as a conscious choice. It starts as survival. You minimize your pain to preserve the connection. You question your own reactions because someone else convinced you they were excessive. You begin to second-guess your inner signals, replacing your truth with doubt, your instincts with hesitation. Over time, this self-abandonment becomes your norm, and the cost is far deeper than confusion. It is a psychological fracture that disconnects you from yourself. When we talk about the aftermath of emotional manipulation, we often focus on the relational damage, but the real destruction happens internally, in the nervous system, in the psyche, in the quiet erosion of self-trust. Carl Jung taught that the psyche is self-regulating when it's allowed to operate in alignment. But when a person consistently suppresses their emotional truth to maintain a false harmony with others, the psyche begins to split. You live on the surface while your inner world becomes buried, silenced, and eventually foreign to you. This disconnection from inner truth has a profound effect on the body and brain. Repeated emotional invalidation triggers chronic stress responses in the nervous system. The body stays in a state of hypervigilance, always scanning for danger, always anticipating criticism or rejection. You may not even notice it at first. It feels like just being anxious or overthinking. But what's really happening is your body is trying to compensate for the absence of emotional safety. When you cannot trust your own emotional reality, your body begins to question everything. You start to feel anxious without knowing why. You may develop insomnia, digestive issues, chronic fatigue. These are not random. They are the body's way of saying something is wrong. Your nervous system is working overtime because it no longer has the guidance of your emotions to regulate your sense of safety. Emotional suppression doesn't lead to peace. It leads to internal chaos disguised as calm. Psychologically, this internal division manifests in a range of ways. Generalized anxiety, emotional dependency, people-pleasing, burnout, and in many cases, a total loss of personal identity. If you've ever found yourself saying, I don't even know who I am anymore. You're not being dramatic. You're articulating a profound psychic reality. You've become a stranger to your own needs, your desires, your instincts. This condition, in Jungian terms, is often the result of over-identifying with the persona. The persona, as Jung described, is the mask we wear to meet the expectations of society. It's not inherently negative. We need it to function socially. But when the persona becomes a performance rather than an expression, when it becomes a fixed identity rather than a flexible interface, we begin to live for approval rather than authenticity. Living in a hyper-persona state means you are constantly adjusting yourself based on what others want, expect, or need. You become adept at reading the room, but lose touch with reading yourself. Your joy becomes muted. Your sadness is silenced. Your anger, if it arises, is quickly dismissed as irrational. You become what you think others will accept, not who you truly are. And eventually, you forget there's even a difference. This kind of self-abandonment isn't just painful, it's dangerous, because it opens the door to further manipulation. If you don't trust your own feelings, you become easy to persuade, to gaslight, to control. You start to rely on others to tell you what's real, what matters, what is worth caring about. Your internal compass rusts from disuse, and you find yourself at the mercy of other people's stories about who you are. In relationships, this creates a cycle of emotional dependency. Because you've been conditioned to doubt yourself, you become more dependent on your partner's approval, presence, or affection to feel stable. You may tolerate behavior that once felt unacceptable. You may justify red flags because the fear of abandonment outweighs the discomfort of staying, and in doing so, you reinforce the belief that your needs are negotiable and your feelings are liabilities. But perhaps the most tragic consequence is what this self-betrayal does to your long-term sense of self-worth. When you continuously override your emotions for the sake of peace or attachment, you send a message to your unconscious. My truth is not important. That belief doesn't just live in your mind. It shapes how you move through the world. You may settle in your career, shrink in social situations, or choose friendships that reflect your diminished self-view. This isn't just low confidence. It's an identity that has been built on repression rather than expression. So how do you begin to return to yourself? The first step is radical permission to feel what you feel without judgment. Emotions are not problems to solve. They are signals to understand. Anxiety might be a sign that something doesn't feel safe. Sadness might be a sign of something ungrieved. Anger might be the voice of a boundary you've long ignored. These signals are not flaws. They are maps. They are the psyche's way of guiding you back to integrity. The next step is gentle but consistent practice in listening. This means journaling not to be productive, but to hear your inner voice. It means creating stillness so that your instincts can emerge without interruption. It means asking yourself, what do I feel? Not, what should I feel? And then honoring whatever answer arises, even if it's messy, inconvenient, or unfamiliar. And finally, it means slowly dismantling the personanot by throwing away your social self. But by integrating it with your inner truth, you can still function in the world, meet expectations, and play your roles, but no longer at the expense of your soul. The goal is not to be raw and exposed at all times. The goal is to no longer confuse the mask for the face. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that privilege is not granted, it is chosen. And it often begins with one quiet but revolutionary act, trusting your own feelings again. Because once you do, your life no longer bends around other people's comfort. It begins to form around your own clarity. You stop living in reaction and start living in alignment. And you return to the truth that was never really lost and buried. waiting for your permission to rise. Freedom is not the absence of control from others. True freedom is when you no longer live at the mercy of your unconscious patterns, when you learn to recognize and integrate the parts of yourself that once lived in the dark. For Carl Jung, this process is called individuation, and it is the central task of psychological and spiritual growth. It is the journey of becoming whole. Individuation is not about becoming someone new. It's about becoming who you truly are beneath the conditioning. The persona, the projections, the inherited stories. It is the slow and deliberate process of bringing your unconscious contents into conscious awareness. That means facing your shadow, not to destroy it, not to judge it, but to understand it, learn from it, and integrate its power into your sense of self. The shadow, as we've discussed, contains the disowned aspects of your personality. These are not just negative traits like anger, jealousy, or insecurity. They can also be your passion, your assertiveness, your intuition, anything that was rejected by your family, your culture, or even your younger self in order to gain approval. Every time you were told to be less emotional, less loud, more agreeable, a piece of you was buried. That accumulation becomes your shadow, and it waits silently until you're strong enough to turn and face it. The journey of individuation begins when you stop trying to fix your life externally and begin the deeper work of turning inward. This work is not glamorous. It's not fast. It doesn't always feel empowering. Sometimes it feels like unraveling. But what unravels is not your essence. It's your illusion. The illusion that love must be earned through sacrifice. The illusion that you have to be liked to be worthy. The illusion that healing means staying silent for the comfort of others. To individuate is to say, I will no longer betray myself for belonging. I will meet the parts of me I've feared, hated, or denied, and I will bring them into the light. But how does this actually look in practice? It begins with awareness, and awareness begins with attention. You must start paying attention to your emotions, not to change them, but to listen when you feel triggered. Rather than reacting or suppressing, pause and become curious. Ask, what is this really about? What part of me feels unseen or unsafe? What belief is being challenged? This kind of emotional inquiry is not about intellectual analysis. It's about being present with your inner experience without judgment. It's about developing the ability to observe rather than immediately react. One of the most powerful tools for this is meditation, not the kind where you try to silence your mind, but the kind where you sit with whatever arises. When a memory surfaces, when shame appears, when anger tightens your chest, breathe into it. Stay with it. Let it teach you. Writing is another essential tool. What Jung called shadow work can be done through what many refer to as a shadow journal. In this space, you write uncensored. You allow yourself to explore the parts of you that feel unacceptable, not to feed them, but to see them clearly. You might write, I feel jealous. I feel rage. I feel needy. I want to be adored. I want to scream. These are not confessions. They are acts of reclaiming, because what you can name, you can own. And what you own no longer owns you. Another key part of individuation is reconnecting with your body. So often we think of healing as a mental task, but your body stores everything your mind suppresses. That tightness in your throat when you don't speak up, that fatigue after spending time with someone who drains you, that nausea when your boundaries are violated. Your body has always been honest even when your mind has been trained to lie. Learning to listen to your body is learning to speak the language of your unconscious. So, how do you rebuild that connection? Start small. Place a hand on your chest when you're overwhelmed and ask, what do I need right now? Sit in silence for 5 minutes before checking your phone in the morning. Practice breathwork when you feel yourself spiraling. These aren't spiritual fads. They're ancient technologies for remembering your aliveness. And as you continue this work, something begins to shift. You start to make decisions from clarity, not compulsion. You begin to respond instead of react. You stop chasing people who confuse you, and you start choosing people who mirror your self-respect. Your life becomes less about managing chaos and more about nurturing peace. This is the essence of individuation. You become less fragmented and more integrated. You no longer live at war with your instincts or in fear of your depth. You stop performing and start aligning. You stop chasing freedom in external validation and discover that it was within you the entire time waiting for your permission to rise. Jung believed that individuation wasn't just psychological, but spiritual. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is the task, not to escape our pain, but to understand it, not to suppress our past, but to weave it into wisdom, not to fake lightness, but to carry our darkness with dignity." There will be moments on this path where you feel alone, where your growth separates you from the people who once felt like home, where clarity costs you comfort. Let it. You are not losing them, you are finding you. And the space they leave behind is not emptiness. It is room for truth. Because in the end, individuation is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's about becoming someone who knows their shadows and still chooses love. Someone who holds their pain and still reaches for joy. Someone who no longer abandons themselves to be understood. This is not an easy journey, but it is the only one that leads to freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to be fully who you are. And that, Jung would say, is the greatest privilege of a lifetime. Real love does not require you to abandon yourself. It doesn't demand that you shrink, perform, or sacrifice your truth in order to be worthy. It does not ask you to become smaller so someone else can feel bigger. Real love meets you where you are. It honors your sensitivity, respects your boundaries, and grows with your evolution. It recognizes that your fullness is not a threat, but a gift. You were never meant to love in order to fix someone. You were never meant to trade your intuition for connection, or your peace for potential. The narrative that you must suffer, wait, or tolerate dysfunction for the sake of love is not. Romanticity is a lie, a dangerous one, and it's time we let it go. Because the truth is, you don't find the right relationship by chasing, you find it by becoming whole. You attract people who see your worth clearly when you stop settling for those who only glimpse it through a fog of their own wounds. You build relationships that nourish you when you start showing up for yourself first. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. Not with walls, but with wisdom. So today, I'm asking you to do something powerful. Start listening to yourself again. Start trusting the part of you that flinched when the words didn't feel right. Even if you couldn't explain why. Start paying attention to the fatigue that follows certain conversations. The self-doubt that creeps in after small, seemingly harmless phrases. The growing silence inside you that once held joy, but now holds fear. Those are not coincidences. They are cues. And learning to respond to them is not weakness, it's strength. The kind of strength that doesn't need to yell or prove itself. The kind of strength that knows when to walk away. Not out of pride, but out of profound self-respect. Healing is not just about leaving the wrong people behind. It's about returning to the parts of yourself that were silenced in order to stay. It's about reclaiming the pieces of your intuition that were traded for false harmony. And it's about realizing that you never needed to be easier to love. You only needed to be seen by someone who loves deeply. So let today be the beginning of that return. Let it be the moment you choose yourself with the same devotion you once gave to others. Let it be the quiet revolution where you stop apologizing for needing more, for feeling deeply, for changing, for saying no. Let it be the day you understand that protecting your energy is not the end of love, it's the beginning of the right kind of love. And if what I've shared resonates with something inside you, if it put words to a truth you've been carrying quietly for too long, I invite you to stay connected. Leave a comment, share your experience, or simply subscribe to the channel so we can keep walking this path together. Because no one should have to navigate the darkness alone. Together, we can build something different, a space where growth is celebrated, where emotional depth is honored, and where love begins not with losing ourselves, but with finding the courage to be fully who we are. Let that be the new standard. Let that be what you hold out for. Let that be what you embody. Not later, not someday, but now, starting with you.